Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very, very special spooky episode of Angie Speaks Patron exclusive movie club. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Today, we're going to be talking about a very special film, one that's like incredibly close to my heart, The Love Witch. So I hope that you've watched it, and if you haven't, I'm going to keep it fairly like spoiler free. But hopefully, this will be kind of a teaser to get you interested. So if you're looking for a film to watch with your friends on Halloween, I definitely feel like this is a good fit, for that. So I guess we'll just kind of dive right into the analysis. 1 second, I just need to check that everything's okay, sound wise. I'm not. The broadcast is actually going on. Just a second.
Sound wise.
There we go. Yeah, everything's cool. So yeah, we'll dive right into the analysis. So this film came out to very kind of mixed reception. A lot of people were quite confused by the story because it's a modern day story that's supposed to be sort of perceived as something that's like happening, in our time. Yet it's shot in this like very Hammer horrors kind of 60s style. And a lot of people kind of criticize the director, who's a female director, female writer director, for being way more about style over substance, and really questioned her choice of aesthetic in the sense. But when you actually read deeper into it, the aesthetic dimension of this film actually has a lot to say about the politics and the themes behind it. So one of the initial issues, I guess, with the way the film was received was the fact that you had a lot of male critics that were comparing this film to 60s Hammer horror and, like 60s Italian horror and like sexploitation. Definitely, a lot of people kind of tried to shove it into the sexploitation genre. But the director herself actually came forward to talk about how this just kind of shows the tone deafness of the male gaze. It's really yes. Ariel says, "Wow, I thought I was watching an old movie. That's amazing that it was made in 2016." Yeah, definitely. A lot of people thought that they were watching an old movie, and a lot of people felt that it was kind of anachronistic in that sense. But they were totally wrong because the film is actually supposed to be set in today. But there's a real reason behind why she chose that style to make the film in. But anyway, I'll continue. So, a lot of the 60s Hammer horror and, Italian horror and sexploitation, was created in order to cater to the male gaze. There was a lot of sort of male gazy subtext under the undertones of it. So you had a lot of like screaming, scantily clad, female protagonists, and Italian horror was a little bit even more insidious in that sense because it kind of glamorized violence against female bodies and made it something that was sort of titillating in that sense. So those genres are kind of notorious for critics kind of taking the piss out of like the misogyny that's kind of inherent within them. So it was quite interesting that a lot of critics tried to lump this film into that genre, when actually, when she was making the film, stylistically, she was inspired by Hammer horror. She was inspired by those old kind of 60s art house films. But really and truly, she was inspired by a lot of films from the 60s that were very quiet kind of domestic dramas and horrors about, the female experience in terms of domesticity and being trapped within the home. So these were the films that she was really inspired by. So if you look past the kind of aesthetic dimension, that's what's really going on here. It's really a story that's kind of a horror / drama about the female experience within domesticity, gender, and expectations that are placed upon certain gender. And this film actually kind of follows that tradition a lot more accurately than the tradition of Hammer horror. The Hammer horror aesthetic is really just there to kind of contrast the message that's actually being put forward in this film. And I guess I could say deconstruct it as well. That was kind of the way that I saw it, is that this film was kind of trying to deconstruct those tropes, those kind of misogynistic tropes that people make fun of in those kind of exploitation horror films, by presenting and sort of putting forward a very strong feminist message. So that's kind of a little bit of background about how the film was received and the criticism that surrounded it, and sort of the, I guess, authorial intent. I know that that's kind of controversial to talk about authorial intent, but I guess that was kind of what she was trying to put across, and she's talked about it quite frequently. So we'll dive right into the narrative, I guess, and start kind of talking about those elements. So the film follows a protagonist, female protagonist, who, you know, is leaving her hometown for some, the film's kind of ambiguous about the reason why she's leaving her hometown, but she arrives in this new town, and, you know, she's moving into a new house and trying to sort of start a new life after going through this traumatic experience. And then we sort of see her relationships with men. That's kind of what the movie is about, even though it's kind of meandering up and down here and there. It's kind of one of those very weird stories. It has that very B-movie kind of disjointed style to it. And a lot of the acting and dialogue is incredibly hammy too, but I love it. So yeah, the film kind of follows her relationships with men, and some of the gender expectations that she's internalized, and it does it in this really wonderfully succinct way, because really and truly, a lot of people, because there's a lot of nudity and a lot of sex in the film, a lot of people kind of criticized it as smart, or, you know, an attempt to appeal to the male gaze or any of those things. But really and truly, it's a deconstruction of that, because our protagonist in this situation is incredibly bereft. And she's using sexuality and femininity as a way out of her pain and her clear mental issues, her clear mental issues. So we kind of see her have this sort of ethos throughout the film about, you know, her purpose is to find a man to please and to be his fantasy. And in this sense, witchcraft is kind of, because she's a witch, that's also part of her character. So she's a witch, she practices witchcraft and occultism, but she uses witchcraft as a way of sort of luring men in and kind of maintaining control over them in that sense. And in this sense, witchcraft is kind of used as a metaphor in the film for feminine wiles, which is somewhat kind of accurate. I mean, there's more to witchcraft, as speaking as a witch myself, there's more to witchcraft than just the use of feminine wiles. That's only one dimension of witchcraft. You know, the idea, and that's kind of the reason why witches were persecuted in the past. The idea that, you know, the femininity was something that was inherently threatening to masculinity, and that women had the ability to charm and beguile with their looks and their sexuality, and then, you know, therefore gain power over men. So in this sense, femininity was sort of demonized, and, you know, you have cultures where women were forced to dress modestly. You have cultures today that still force women to dress modestly and kind of conceal their sexuality in that sense. But here we kind of see the protagonist using her sexuality as a weapon and as a way to gain control, as a way to kind of, but not only as a weapon, but as a way to fill the hole that's within her. She feels like the only purpose that she has is to find a man, and not only to kind of cater to his needs, but to be his ultimate fantasy as well. And you kind of see this fantasy that she has of being like the anima for some guy kind of fall apart, you know, during the course of the film. And it's a really, really very interesting message, because of course the film looks beautiful on an aesthetic level. It's it looks like the inside of a cake. It's a gorgeous, absolutely, absolutely gorgeous film. But at the same time, there's a darkness, and there's a longing as well to the way that the character kind of interacts with the world. You know, she does a lot of very unscrupulous, very dangerous things, very scary things in the film. And that's kind of another trope that I guess you could say comes from the Hammer horror tradition, of following the monster as protagonist, the monster as anti-hero. That's another sort of trope that this film takes, because we see her engage in some very unsavory and somewhat frightening behaviors during the film. But it's all because of what's going on inside of her and her inability to kind of deal with her underlying insecurity. You know, we hear kind of in the story about how she had an abusive husband who who was very kind of critical of her and didn't appreciate her, and wasn't somebody who was supportive of her. She also had daddy issues too, no surprise there. And she hasn't had very good experiences with her interactions with men. So she believes that the only way that she can kind of fill that hole within her, or find any sort of fulfillment in her life, is to be exactly what she thinks a man wants. And the protagonist in this film, the actress that she's very, very beautiful, incredibly charming throughout the whole film. But there's a part where you actually see, you go to the scene in her room where you see, all the makeup and all the wigs and all the clothes, and, the fact that, she has to take a long time to put herself together to look the way that she looks, and that it's not something that's just organic, that it actually takes time and effort, and it's this very contrived kind of effort that she's putting into being this fantasy for the men that she encounters. And I thought that that was actually quite refreshing to see, like, the wig stand and, like, the eyelash stand, and to show that this isn't how women naturally look. Femininity is kind of an illusion in that sense. It's kind of just a toy. It's toys that we play with. There's nothing sort of inherent about it. And I thought that that was a very interesting way of deconstructing the gender norms that she's internalized. And we also have a character in the film, her friend, the lady who leased her the house, who's also kind of dealing with her own feminine insecurity, especially because the main character, the protagonist, goes and sleeps with this woman's husband. And she puts the protagonist on a pedestal. She sees her as this really beautiful, really mysterious and beguiling and charming woman. And, the part where she goes into her house and starts to try on her clothes and try on femininity. She's obviously a woman who's never really kind of paid that much mind to trying to be this feminine ideal. But because she feels insecure, she then puts on that mask herself. And, it feels good for a moment. She feels as if she's finally kind of worthy of admiration. But then when she's confronted with the protagonist, she sees that it's an illusion, and that it's not necessarily something to aspire to when things kind of spiral out of control in that sense. For those of you who have watched the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. It explores the inherent sense of competition that a lot of women feel with each other. And how that comes from our insecurities, and how our ability to deal with our insecurities often leads us to act out in really terrible ways. And it also shows you what happens when the male gaze becomes the center, and how much pressure that also puts on people who sort of are very kind of wrapped up in that paradigm, I guess. So I guess the next part of what I want to talk about as well is the parallels between domestic drama and domestic horror, 60s domestic dramas and 60s domestic horrors, and this film. So one of the films that came to mind immediately for me was definitely Rosemary's Baby, and a few others that sort of deal with the idea of the woman in the home, and the kind of pressures and expectations that are thrust upon the woman in the home, and how women will often use sexuality as an escape from their problems or act out. It kind of got me thinking about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, like all of these kind of films that are centered around, domesticity and womanhood and all of these things. It's about how women will often use sexuality and fantasy as an escape from the rigid societal expectations that are placed upon them to conform to certain gender norms. And you really see this protagonist take that to the extreme. You see her take this to the most extreme level. And you also see how that doesn't fix anything, and how that often makes things worse. And it kind of, spurred a really big cultural conversation when the film came out. There was a lot of conversation going on around, roles and role reversal and gender roles, and deconstructing gender roles, and creating more options in terms of domesticity, and not having domesticity be as limiting as it once was in the past. And as somebody who is a woman, I can definitely say a lot of, from my experience, what I feel anyway, is that those rigid expectations haven't really gone away. even though there's a lot of options now for women in terms of like what we can do, and you know, we're allowed to choose who we want to marry, we can hold down jobs, there's still somewhat of that expectation to maintain some form of domesticity. And there's also a material kind of incentive to do so as well, because it's a lot, if you're a single woman, you're a lot more likely to be in poverty, even within the Western world. So that's still the case. And how it's not as if you're active in the same way that a man can be active in the world. You still have to maintain that sort of passivity in a sense. And that then often leads to kind of using this kind of illusion version of femininity as an escape from those expectations, and as an escape from that pressure to conform to certain ideals, by actually taking on those ideals and donning them in a way that you feel gives you back control. Back to the coven kind of witchcraft element of the film. You know, she's part of a coven. She's part of some kind of group of witches or pagans, and you know, it's run by a man. A man is the head of the coven, and one of the things that he does is kind of prey upon young women by teaching them to use their feminine wiles as a way of gaining power in the world. And because that's the only means to power that they have, that's what he kind of teaches them, is their only means to power is their sexuality, their bodies, their ability to beguile and charm and all of those different things. And, you know, the protagonist of the film kind of takes this on as an edict. She really, really believes that her only route to power, her only route to stability, and her only route to having a fulfilling life is her ability to use her beauty, use her charm and her sexuality as a form of control. And that's kind of what witchcraft is characterized as in the film. It's characterized as that kind of force of attraction, that force of the ability to kind of beguile and cast a spell over, you know, this person or that person in that sense. And I found that very, very interesting. You know, we often talk about toxic masculinity, but toxic femininity isn't necessarily something that really gets as much shine in that sense. Nobody really talks about toxic femininity. And I think that this film is definitely a cautionary tale against toxic femininity. And it's sort of a natural conclusion of what happens when one internalizes a lot of the messages that society sends about what women should be and how they should act and what would give a woman a fulfilling life. And I can definitely say that, yeah, desirability is definitely one of the things that women are told they have to be. You have to be desirable. You have to, you know, be able to turn on the charm when it suits you. You know, it's seen as a route to power. And I mean, everybody from Beyonce to, I don't know, Taylor Swift pushes this same kind of message, which can be very, very harmful. Which is why, yeah, again, this film really does a good job of deconstructing these sorts of very rigid ideals that are thrust upon women. One of the things that I really relate to in this film, I definitely relate to this film. I felt kind of called out by it when I first saw it. I was going through some situations in my life at the time, and it was a bit before one of my friends recommended the film to me, and I watched it and I was like, holy shit, okay, I'm seeing my shadow on the screen. I'm seeing like my shadow on the screen. And also I'm a fan of horror. I'm a fan of the 60s. Like this, the whole 60s aesthetic is like very much my vibe. So it just kind of felt like someone had like made a film for me. But one of the things that I definitely relate to is her feeling of being bereft, and you know, what that, instead of dealing with those negative emotions, kind of internalizing a lot of shit from society about how you need to be. And also, you know, boredom and dissatisfaction with domestic life can oftentimes lead women to act out sexually. This is kind of known. This is a known thing. This is very known. Yeah, it can definitely lead people, not just women, like people in general, to act out sexually. And this is kind of the kind of feminine portrayal of that. And you know, she also isn't very friendly to other women in the film. again, this is like another element of toxic femininity. She cheats on, she becomes a mistress to her best friend's husband without any remorse or guilt. She definitely sees other women who don't internalize the same kind of gender norms that she does as beneath her. And she feels like she has all the answers, even though at the end she is bereft. One of the really interesting things that I thought really, really compounded the point home was the fact that she kind of met her match in the police officer that she was dating. He's somebody who didn't necessarily, he saw through the bullshit. A lot of the other men that she was able to kind of beguile and bewitch it throughout the film were not kind of switched on to the game that she was playing or the wiles that she was using. They were like fodder to her, which was why she grew bored very easily. This is somebody who doesn't necessarily know what they want out of a romantic partner. This is somebody who doesn't necessarily want what it takes to actually connect with somebody on a visceral level. This is somebody who is afraid of vulnerability. She's afraid of her own vulnerability, and she's afraid of the vulnerability of others, which is why when the men that she's with get vulnerable and like open to her, she kind of freaks out and she's like, oh, this is gross. There's that line where she's like smoking a cigarette and she's like, what a pussy. I thought that was really funny. But she kind of meets her match in this police officer, and he has his own fucked up ideals. He's kind of like the polar opposite. So if she embodies toxic femininity, he embodies toxic masculinity. He's cold, he's stoic, he's very far removed, he's not very emotionally involved in the relationship. He kind of just sees it as a means to an end and sees her as a means to an end. He's so pessimistic, even to the point that he believes that the feminine ideal only exists within a man's head, and that when you stay with a woman for too long, you'll eventually get bored of them. There was that scene at the Renaissance Fair, which is like my favorite scene. When that scene happened, I was like, oh my God, this movie is like amazing. I'm like in love with this film. Whoever made this film is a fucking genius. But yeah, there was that scene at the Renaissance Fair where we hear both of their internal monologues and how they kind of contrast each other. And you really see the collision between this toxic feminine ideal and this toxic masculine ideal, and how it just kind of creates this like sludge of like toxicity. The brilliant Dr. Fly says, hey, Angie, I haven't had a chance to watch the film, but wanted to come hear your thoughts about it regardless. Oh, thank you for coming. I definitely hope, if you haven't seen it, that you'll give it a chance and put it on your list this Halloween. It's a really, really, really good watch, and something that is definitely fun to watch with friends, because there's a lot of weird, like kooky moments that happen. But yeah, as I was saying, you see these two forces kind of collide, and what that then brings up. So this movie really does explore relationships, love, sex, sexuality, and also politics as well, from like this sort of feminine perspective, and how when one doesn't have a sound analysis of themselves or the world, or how the world views them, you kind of often end up falling into these sort of pre-designed patterns that are incredibly, incredibly toxic. And the thing about this film is a lot of the mentalities that she espouses, even though they may sound ridiculous to our modern ears, they were fairly commonplace, in the 50s and the 60s. I know that, from talking to my mom and my grandmother about, the sorts of things they were told about how to be a woman and what the standard of femininity was. They were forced to internalize a lot of really toxic stuff, a lot of really, really problematic stuff about, the male gaze, how to please a man, how to keep a man, what to be to a man, behaviors not to portray if you want your man to feel comfortable. Because really and truly, economically for women, if you were unmarried, it was pretty catastrophic, not only for you, but also for your family. You then became a financial liability to your family if you were unmarried in those days, because women didn't have as many options in terms of self-actualization financially and in the world in general. The woman's place was in the home, and that's kind of, there's still a residual effect of that even within our generation, even though we claim that we're better than that now and we're all woke. That there's still an economic incentive for a woman to be in the home, the material conditions that we are under in society often affect the kinds of family structures that are created. And right now, the nuclear family and the woman being in the home is still kind of the standard, and it's still the one that's the most economically feasible, and and the one that's the most economically tolerated as well. And a lot of women during those days, used femininity as an escape. Femininity is fun. Femininity is something that anybody from any gender can play around with. It's fun to dress up. It's fun to wear makeup. It's fun to like experiment with your hair, with your features. It's fun to use different things to accentuate your beauty. It's also fun to have other people recognize your beauty as well, and to see you as desirable. That's something that's definitely a good feeling, but it's a surface level thing. And if you allow that to be the end all be all of your goals and desires, it oftentimes leads to really bad results if your ego and your self-esteem is hinged upon those things. And during those days, a lot of women used femininity as an escape. Domestic life and the life that they were given, the life that they were forced into some of the time as well, oftentimes was incredibly limiting and very boring. And it was also disappointing as well, especially for women who were educated or who had ambition. It was very limiting. So yeah, a lot of women ended up using femininity as an escape and as a route for self-expression, or even as a tool to have power over their partners. The typical kind of trope of like the pussy trap. I can't believe I just said that. But yeah, it's like the typical kind of trope of the pussy trap, that once you're able to kind of understand a man's desires and be that and give that to him, then you kind of have him for life, type of situation. And it created this sort of very toxic mentality around womanhood and femininity, and it became more of an addiction and a detrimental thing than anything that was wholesome or life affirming. One of the things that I sort of learned from watching this film is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to look good or wanting to be desired, but you can't allow that to be the end all be all. It has to be for you. You have to do those things for you because it makes you feel good, not necessarily because you're trying to be someone's ideal or somebody's like anima or animus or whatever. I struggled with that, especially when I was a lot younger. If I liked a guy, if I was into a guy, the first thing I would do was find out what he liked or what he was interested in, and then I would try to sort of mold myself in a way to kind of fit that, or make myself like the dream girl in that sense. And I know that there are a lot of people who have done that, even though they wouldn't care to admit it. But that's why horror is such a great thing, because it helps explore the shadow side, the stuff that we don't talk about, the stuff that we push into the emotional closet. And I definitely think this film really, really compounded that for a lot of people who were affected by watching it, is kind of the things that we don't talk about, the mentalities that women are kind of forced to internalize, and these kind of ideas around how to be the perfect wife, how to be the perfect partner, how to be desirable sexually, and that becoming the end goal, rather than actually just something that you can enjoy yourself or with your partner or whatever in order to have a fulfilling experience. It's more about, how to control or how to keep or how to, it's definitely interesting. And this is one of the first films I've seen that's really like explored that in a way that was as honest and as straightforward as it was. And it did it in a really fun way. It wasn't like this didactic kind of preachy feminist edict. It was still very fun, and it was still very very funny, and it was still visually like amazing in my opinion. But there's a lot of subtext there to unpick, and it gave me a lot of food for thought in terms of maybe some of the things that I had been internalizing about womanhood and like femininity and all this stuff. It definitely shows you how femininity is really just an illusion. It's not something that's inherent to anybody, but it's fun. I won't lie. I very much enjoy, dressing up and being witchy. That's definitely something that I enjoy doing, but it's definitely, there are way more like aspects to me and my character than than just, you know, lipstick and trying to be somebody's fucking fantasy. And I definitely think the ending compounded that. The ending scene compounded that, because we actually see the protagonist slip into this fantasy world. She chose the fantasy over the reality in that sense. She chose death over life. She chose the fantasy because in the fantasy world, this fantasy of her being the perfect partner and having the perfect man that would love her and see her and appreciate her and complete her was what she wanted, more than actually living and having to deal with the problems and having to actually go inward and actually reflect on some of the things that clearly are screaming to be healed within her. She's clearly not mentally stable, for sure. Yeah, I thought the ending was also kind of compounded that point that, you know, that this fantasy world that we create has absolutely nothing to do with reality. And if you try to create your relationship on a fantasy, it's going to fail, and it's not going to do very well. But yeah, it's definitely a great film, and the dreamlike quality of the film, you know, there are certain sequences that feel like you're in a dream. The dreamlike quality of the film is something that definitely stuck with me, because again, it's another way of showing that this is a fantasy, this is not reality, this is somebody who's living in their own head. And I definitely thought that kind of 60s Technicolor film style really kind of compounded the fact that this is a fantasy world, this person isn't living in reality. And you know, it just gets more and more trippy. It gets more and more trippy. We kind of devolve more and more down the rabbit hole, as the story goes, and until we finally actually kind of teleport out of reality and permanently into this woman's fantasy of who she is and how she wants the world to be. Yeah, so yeah, it definitely belongs in the feminist horror canon for sure. I'm a really huge fan of this movie. I definitely think so, and I think that when it first came out, it came out to sort of tepid reception, but people are now kind of giving it a second look and really kind of examining some of these themes. It's a really great film. I'm gonna leave it open for questions now, or if any of you have any observations about the film, feel free to type them in the chat box, while and I'll read them out if you guys have any questions or observations or anything that you wanna, any hot takes about how you thought the film was. And for those of you who haven't seen the film yet, I highly recommend it. This Halloween, because my boyfriend Jake hasn't seen this film, so I'm gonna watch it with him when he gets back from San Francisco. And then we're also gonna be watching the new Suspiria film as well, which I haven't seen, which is another kind of feminist witchy film that came out a couple of years ago. I've seen the original Suspiria, but I haven't seen the new remake with Tilda Swinton yet. So that's on my movie list for Halloween. And then every year I watch Rosemary's Baby. It's become a tradition for me to watch Rosemary's Baby. So I'm going to watch that too. And then I'm looking for a slasher film too, because I haven't seen the first Halloween, and I haven't seen the first Jason film either. I was never really that much of a fan of like the slasher genre, but I'm definitely going to give that a little peeky try this Halloween, because I feel like I'm always like into the like weird kind of abstract art house, like supernatural stuff. I would love to see an art house slasher film made, because there are a lot of the modern art house horror that's coming out these days really focuses a lot on like the supernatural. There's no slasher films that have kind of there's no kind of deconstruction of the slasher genre. I mean, I guess Scream was that back in the 90s, but I think it'd be really interesting if there was a slasher horror, like a new kind of slasher horror that came out. Because I love the thrill of like the blood pumping and like, you know, like, oh my god, don't go in the closet kind of like vibe of those films. Definitely gets my blood pumping. But yeah, those films are on my list. But yeah, I definitely highly recommend that The Love Witch be on your list if you're looking for something fun and kind of spooky and interesting and a little bit sexy as well. There's a lot of sexual situations and nudity in the film. Sonic says, keep in mind Friday the 13th Part 1 doesn't have Jason as the killer. He's the killer for the first time in Part 2. Okay. Yeah, as you can see, like I'm not super familiar with the slasher genre, but it's definitely something that I'm definitely wanting to get more into. I feel like there's a lot in the slasher genre that like needs to be unpicked. So I'm definitely like absorbing takes and like watching a lot of the films. And then there's Happy Death Day. I still need to watch that. Oh yeah, I heard about Happy Death Day. I need to check that out as well. I haven't seen it. I've seen a couple of interesting thrillers as well, that are kind of the slasher, but I wouldn't necessarily say they were horror. They were more thrillers. I might put some of those up for the Patreon movie club at one point. But I think we're going to kind of the next Patreon movie club will step away from horror. I think I've been bombarding you guys with horror a lot lately, but that's just only because it's like my favorite genre. But yeah, The Love Witch. Give it a watch if you haven't seen it already. It doesn't look as if any of you have any questions, which is totally cool. Well, in that case, I hope that you've enjoyed my little analysis of The Love Witch. It's a really, really, really great feminist horror film, and I hope you enjoyed it if you actually did watch it, and if you didn't watch it, I highly, highly recommend it. I'm going to do another one of these in a couple of weeks, but this time around I'm going to put up a poll so that people can vote on which film. I'll pick around 3 or 4 films, and then we'll do a vote to see, like, you know, which one everybody wants to watch, and then we can have like a nice, like, critical discussion about, you know, the subtext, you know, all of those different fun parts of the film. But thank you guys for coming. I always have such a great time talking to you. Keep your eyes peeled on the channel. The Halloween special is dropping soon. So it will be for patrons. You guys will get it on the 30th. Hopefully, if all the editing squares out, because I'm editing with Peter Coffin right now, so it's been kind of an uphill battle. But hopefully, it will be up on the Patreon page on the 30th for you guys, and on the normal channel on the 31st on Halloween Day for everybody else. It looks really, really good. It's a dramatization of Mark Fisher's Exit the Vampire Castle. And yeah, we wrote like a script and kind of dramatized some of the key points of that essay, basically. So that's going to be that. It's really, really fun. It's a really, really fun one. So keep your eyes peeled for that. I'm also supposed to be making a thank you, Elwin. Thank you very much. I'm also supposed to be making an appearance on the Michael Brooks show as well on the 29th, which I'm really excited about as well. Sonic says, definitely fun listening to your thoughts on that. Oh man, I'm excited. I'm really glad. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, so Michael Brooks on the 29th as well. So those are the two things that are going to close out October. And then November, there'll be another video on the channel as well. So Halloween special, and then November, there'll be another big video as well. And then December will be the Christmas special. So yeah, there's quite a lot going on and a lot for you guys to look forward to. I also did a tarot stream yesterday. If any of you missed it, that was really fun. So you can check that out as well. And I'm around. There's so much going on at the moment. But I'll definitely be keeping everyone posted about everything on Twitter and in the Patreon Discord. And if you're a patron and you haven't joined the Discord yet, you should do so. There's a link on the page to join the Discord. But thank you so much for coming, and much love to all of you. Happy Samhain, and I shall see you later. Bye. Ooh, there we go. And